All right, team. I have our study guide here. I'm going to go through it quickly. I know you have all the answers anyway, so you could just look at that. But if you want some explanation behind the why, or if you just like to hear things while you read it, there's an extra multiple intelligence in there with that. That'll help you remember. So this is a study guide that you have. I'm going to make the test based upon this. So you study this, you'll know what's on the test. So Transcontinental Railroad, you can read along on pages 146 to 153, but the purpose was to connect the coast through the railroads. So all the miners are out on the West Coast. People are moving out there, but they don't have an easy way to get supplies or an easy way to transport. So they had to go through the mountains, all that stuff. So they needed to connect the coasts. And so that's kind of the purpose, connect the coast. The reasons people migrated west and didn't have many supplies or resources, and then it allowed them to transport quickly. Two different railroads involved. So for companies involved, we have the Union Pacific Railroad and Central Pacific. Pacific is in both names. One is in the middle, Central, and one is Union Pacific. So the Central Pacific should have been in the center. That would make sense. But if we look at the map down here, Central Pacific actually started out on the far west coast, and the Union Pacific started in the middle. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So Union Pacific, Central Pacific, they're motivated because they got paid by the amount of ground they covered. So the more ground they covered, the more they get paid. And then referring to that, there's a question that's going to ask which one had an advantage and why. And the Union Pacific had an advantage because it goes through all this plain Jane, Nebraska flatland instead of going through the mountains. So instead of having to blast through and make the ground level, it was already level. They could just lay tracks. So Union Pacific had a huge advantage. Chinese and Irish are the two primary immigrant groups involved. And we talked about how the Chinese got a lot of bad jobs where they're blowing stuff up. Many of them died. They met in Promontory Point, Utah. So that's out in this vicinity. I think right in here. And so that's obviously Union Pacific smoked them. For the terms, you can look these up. You need to know kind of in your own words, but also be able to tell what it is. Free enterprise system, it just means that you can open your own business. It's not going to be a country controls your business. Petroleum is a fancy name for oil. It's a fuel that burns easily. So something that Rockefeller got rich off of. Entrepreneur is somebody who decides this is a good business opportunity. I'm going to take a risk. A lot of times there's a big financial risk. They're risking a lot of money, and they invest in something to try to make more money. That's an entrepreneur. Skyscraper, probably know what it is, tall building. John D. Rockefeller, he's the guy who got rich off of oil. So we talked about one student has an oil company. He has to pay $1.59 per gallon. And so he has to charge at least $1.60 to make any money. And I'm getting it for less. And because I have more companies, I can afford to lose money for a little while with my oil company. So I can charge $1.45. He can't compete with me because if he did the same thing, he would actually lose money per gallon he sold and he'd go out of business. So John D. Rockefeller was fairly ruthless, and because he had a whole bunch of companies combined together, he could afford to sell it at a cheaper price until the other companies went out of business, which is called a monopoly. Got super rich. He was also the one then that wanted to change his image, and so he and his son started donating money to charities, and then they published their philanthropy or their giving, and so people thought of them as good people rather than just rich people hogging all the money. Andrew Carnegie, similar story to Rockefeller. Those names often go together because they're around the same time frame, but Carnegie was in the steel industry. He figured out how to mass produce steel. So instead of making one thing at a time, he made giant barrels of it. And when you're making giant barrels of it quicker, it's going to take less labor. It's going to be easier to make it. It's going to be faster to make it and less expensive. And so he mass produced it, and all of a sudden we had tons and tons of uses for steel. Super rich dude also. Thomas Edison, most famous for the light bulb. Not the first inventor of the light bulb, but the first inventor to actually make the light bulb really work. He also had a few other inventions like the phonograph, which is like a music player or a sound machine, an electric voting machine. But the main thing you need to know is the light bulb. Alexander Graham Bell should ring a bell just like a phone, a telephone ringing. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in 1876. He had a couple others also. And then Latimer Lewis, he worked with both of these gentlemen, and he was less famous, probably because of his skin color. And he made the light bulb the most practical because he updated it to a carbon filament. Basically, it just took a longer time to burn. So Thomas Edison, something else that these guys did was they made a big, huge electric factory that was able to sustain a city and a power grid. How is the world smaller? We talked about what does it mean to be smaller. The world didn't actually shrink, but if you had a brother who moved out to California, you would never see him again. You'd probably never hear from him again, wouldn't be able to communicate with him, maybe send letters. If you figure out what his address is, he goes out to California, he knows your address, he can send you a letter, and then you can communicate back and forth. But the world is a lot smaller because now there's a telephone. You can pick up a telephone and talk to somebody on the other side of the United States, 4,000 miles away. Pretty small. You could hop on a train and be there in 3 days and go visit him. The world is pretty small. And that was something that 50 years prior, neither one of those things were a thought. So the world got much smaller with those two advancements. Next section, next lesson, immigrants, they came from Europe and they came from Asia. Those are continents, not countries, not states. The United States is a country, not a continent. We live on North America. Europe is a continent. Asia is a continent. If we looked at a world map, if they came from Europe, the East Coast is closer, and they went into New York. So Ellis Island in New York. If they're in Asia, that's on the West Coast. The West Coast is closer over the Pacific, and they came in through Angel Island by San Francisco Bay. That's where the majority came. They often lived in tenements, which are poorly made apartments. Obstacles faced, you only need 3, and there's a bunch here. Language barrier, they couldn't speak English. A lot of times poorly educated. The kids were poor, the families were poor, so the kids had to go to work. They didn't get to go to school. They didn't have an education, and so they kind of got stuck in this rut where they were poor, they didn't have an education, so they couldn't get a good job. So their kids would be poor, so they had to work also. So they couldn't get an education, so they couldn't get a good job. So there's just kind of that cycling effect. Low wages, poor work environments, discrimination. There's the Chinese Exclusion Act. So for a while, there's actually a law that said we're only taking so many Chinese people. So if you try to come over, we're sending you back. Some of the factors of the Great Migration. So the Great Migration was a whole bunch of African Americans were in the South and moved up to the North. And they moved up to the North for a couple reasons. One, there's a whole bunch of floods and insects destroying crops at this time, and factories needed workers. So they had no work down south. And if they did have work, a lot of times it wasn't fair. We had talked about how some of the slave owners still managed to basically keep their slaves through sharecropping. They would pay them a very terrible wage and said, hey, I'll provide room and board for you, and a terrible wage, so you're never able to get off the farm or the plantation. And so they were kind of stuck. So they went up north for the factories. And it says, what other factors not mentioned in this chapter? That wasn't mentioned in the chapter as far as the slaveries go. The floods and insects were, and the factories. Next thing, discrimination, Jim Crow laws at state level, local levels. They allowed people, so that'd be like if Nebraska passed a law or if Madison County passed a law, that's the equivalent, just allowing unfair treatment. I'm going to go ahead and stop there for a second, and I'm going to break this into a few small parts. That way, if you have mastered one part, you can move on to the next, and you don't have to study this part again. So we're going to go ahead and stop the video now.